Hello, everyone. Hope you are all doing very well. Thank you for being here today. My name is Felipe Correales. I work at the research department at the AFD, the French Development Agency. Welcome today to a new session of the Research Conversations webinar series that is organized by the research department at the AFD. And we are glad as well because today we are going to present and share with you the main results of the studies and the research that we have been implementing in Colombia with our partners since 2021. So we are glad to share these results with you today. The agenda is quite full, so I'm gonna pass to give the floor to Lamine. So, but before that, uh, I want just to mention that you have two tabs on your right side of the screen: the chat tab and the question tab. Please use the questions tab to send your questions during the presentations and during the whole webinar. We will answer them at the end, and there is a special button where you can like or dislike, not, I think it's like, the questions that you like, so we can answer those who are most liked. So with further ado, I will give the floor to Lamine So, who is the director of AFD in Colombia. Lamine, please.
Thank you, Felipe. Hello to everyone. I'm very pleased to introduce this week's AFD Research Conversation Seminar organized by AFD Research Department, which I thank today, with the objective of creating a space for discussion on the research and analysis work that is being carried out with our partners on topics that are, I think, essential to our societies today and for Colombia, of course, such as environmental changes and societal challenges. Today, as director of AFD in Colombia, it is also a pleasure to introduce this session, as we will be presenting the studies on inequalities in Colombia that we have developed with our partners, the DANE, Hacienda, and the DNP, in close collaboration, of course, with FEDESarrollo. I would like to thank them for their trust and the work we have done and we will do. And we hope to continue accompanying them in the discussions and support to public policies here in Colombia. I also take this opportunity to thank the European Union, as the results to be presented today are part of the program of the extension of the facility on inequalities financed by the European Union and implemented by AFD to accompany 4 countries in the implementation of public policies to reduce inequalities. In the chat box, you will find the link for more information. In Colombia specifically, we have implemented two studies so far. One is the multidimensional diagnostic, and the other the fiscal incidence analysis. For the first one on inequalities, this study makes an exhaustive analysis at national level, and in which the sectors, areas of life, and regions of the countries are analyzed from multiple dimensions and multiple angles. The results are sometimes alarming and deserve particular attention as when we see, for example, that the Gini index calculated for land tenure is above 0.9. On the other hand, the fiscal incidence analysis aims at understanding the role of the tax structure and social spending on the reduction of inequalities in the country. With this tool, We were also able to make multiple simulations of public policy, of course, hand in hand with the government, and one of them was the tax reform. The results will be presented today, and we hope this will be useful to all of you. Special greetings to Laura Castillo, economist at UNDP Colombia, and Jairo NÚñEZ from Fedesarrollo, who will kindly present the latest results of the study on perceptions in Colombia, which complements our analysis on inequalities and taxation very well. And also special welcome and thanks for being here today. I hope your connection is now okay, Daniel. So Daniel is with us, the Director of Macroeconomic Policies in Hacienda, Daniel Osorio. Buenos dias, Daniel, to whom I would like to ratify our willingness to accompany the government in the great transformations and reforms that still need to be implemented and will be implemented. So finally, thank you to all of the participants for being here today, and I wish you a very fruitful webinar. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Lamine. I think you have said everything and introduced our panelists. So with further ado as well, I will give the floor to Jairo, who is going to present the main results of the diagnostic, as you mentioned, Lamine, and the result of our fiscal incidence analysis in Colombia. Jairo, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you, Felipe. Good morning, everybody. Excuse me, but my computer screen is very, very small, and I couldn't read it well, and I am gonna have to project it on a monitor that is behind the laptop. Okay, I am going to present the diagnostic on inequalities with some very simple figures that in the end explain how inequalities are reproduced in Colombia. Let's start with the basic numbers. This is the Gini coefficient for income, 0.5, for consumption, 0.41, for goods and assets, 0.66, and financial wealth, 0.72, and for land and real estate wealth, that is 0.81. We decompose the Gini coefficients of inequality in consumption between and within some groups, by education level and by poverty. We can see that a large part of the inequalities in Colombia arise from the enormous difference in consumption between urban and rural zones, 66% of the total inequality. However, when the inequalities are analyzed by educational level, they are deeper within each educational level. For example, there are large differences between those who only reach secondary or tertiary education. And lastly, when analyzed by poverty level, inequalities are obviously concentrated between the two groups, the poor and the non-poor, and almost nothing due to the difference with each group. And this is the Gini coefficient for the last 20 years in Colombia. So we are presenting considerable falls for 2002 to 2017. But in the 2017, the Gini increased a lot. What explains the changes in this period? First, to the left of this graph are the variables that help it to decrease the Gini, and to the right, the variables that help it to increase the Gini coefficient. For example, between 2002 and 2020, most of the reduction in inequalities occurred thanks to conditional transfers to the poorest household, 150% of the change, followed by a formalization of employment in the labor market. On the other hand, the pensions, okay, that bring regressive subsidies operated in the opposite direction, reducing a good part of the potential of the transfer on the change. And the increase in the Gini in the last period is due to the increase in the unemployment in Colombia. Here we have the education coverage comparing the urban and rural zones. Educational coverage differs enormously between the urban and rural sector. In the total coverage, the difference is more than 20 points, 20 percentage points. For example, in secondary education, the difference is double. 30 points in secondary education, 12 points in primary education, and 18 points in preschool education. This difference between urban and rural zones explain their trajectory in the market and income inequalities between the urban and the rural zone. And here we have the quality of education between public. This is the public education, and this is the private education. So how many people reach the highest level in the quality test? The highest level is level 3 and level 4. This graph this graph presents the results on the quality of private and public education according to 4 levels. Level 4 being the highest quality, and level 1 the lowest quality. We can observe in the year 2020 that for private education, 72 of students reach the highest levels, levels 4 and levels 3. But for public education, only 53% reach the highest levels in the quality test. This is a difference of almost 20 points. A similar exercise is done by 4 socioeconomic levels that come from the same test. The level 1 is the poorest, and the level 4 is the richest of the population. By 2020, 87 of students from the highest socioeconomic level reach the highest levels in the education quality test, while the poorest or the lowest socioeconomic level, only 34 of students reach these levels. This is a difference in quality of 53 percentage points. Again, this explains the inequalities that will happen the rest of the lives. First, because with those low levels of quality in public education and in the lowest socioeconomic levels, it will be very difficult, almost impossible, to enter higher education, which will limit the opportunities of these young people for the rest of their lives. This is the access to health and coverage by quintiles. For example, in 2003, the difference in access, the difference in access to health by income quintiles were very marked 20 years ago. Only 47% of people from quintile 1 were affiliated with health insurance in 2023. In 2020, the gap in access of health has closed because 90% of people in the first quintile have access. Progress in the health sector maybe is one of the most significant in Colombia, and probably the aspect where the greatest social change has been observed in the country. Let's see the labor market difference between quintiles. For example, let's focus on the year 2019. The global participation rate in quintile 1 is 70%. the global participation rate in quintile 1 is 72%, while in quintile 5 is 91%, almost a 20-point difference in the labor supply of these segments, of these two segments of the population. The employment rate is the labor demand differs enormously between income levels. 25 percentage point difference between quintile 1 and quintile 5. The unemployment rate is 3 times higher in quintile 1 than that for quintile 5. Okay, and finally, inactivity rate is 30 points when comparing quintile 1 and 5. This difference in the labor market are partly a consequence of the low access and quality of education system in the most vulnerable populations, and will be the expression that marks the inequalities in all other aspects of life, but also the future of the next generation. This is the story of how inequalities are reproduced in Colombia, and why our country is one of the most inequitable in the world. Here we have the gap in labor income by gender. This is the gap for different groups. For example, the gender gap in labor income is 29% among independent and informal workers. For example, if a man earns $100 on average, a woman earns 71. However, the gap between formal workers is relatively small and only 5%. The gender gap is very high in the 25th percentile. It is 40%, which indicates that it is among the poorest population where the greatest gender gap occurs, and this has an impact on the low empowerment of women and the risk when men abandon home. In other studies, we have found that this is one of the most alarming poverty traps in Colombia. And this is a map, inequality in access and service by multidimensional indices by department in Colombia. At the regional level, we also find large difference in multidimensional inequalities. Departments such as Córdoba, Caldas, and the country's capital, Bogota, present the highest indices of inequality. And combining the multidimensional dimension of assets, ownership, and access to service with the income dimension, we also found large difference at the department level. The literature on regional convergence indicates that in Colombia there is a phenomenon of divergence in gross domestic product per capita, and these maps indicate that inequalities are not only between departments but also within departments. Okay, and this is the access to water by income quantiles. Unlike the health sector that we saw, access to drinking water differs enormously by income quantiles, and the gap that was observed 20 years ago remains almost identical in 2020. However, the continuity, 24 hours, 7 days in the water service has decreased a lot between 2003 and 2020 in the water service. But there are still important gaps that also affect the health and well-being of the people in Colombia. This graph summarizes the difference by quantiles in access to different services. First, we can say that health service and electricity are universal, but there are important differences in internet access, 88%, and 28% and 81% in quantile 5. In access to water, there's a big gap in the quality of housing floors and in the garbage collection service. First, conclusions for this first part. Income inequalities are part of a change that begins from the first years of life, goes through the accumulation of human capital, and ends with access to the labor market. Failures in these linkages generate deep inequalities in per capita income, which are transmitted between generations. Second, they depend much more on the quality and efficiency of child protection system, the health system, the education system, job training, and much less on subsidies. Third, income distribution, the inequality in goods and assets, financial wealth, and land wealth. Studies by the Central Bank of Colombia indicate that there's a divergence in the 21st century, and that for most of the period study, mining and the public sector were the main drivers of convergence in Colombia. The internet and housing present the greatest inequalities, while health and energy are almost universal services. And in the rural sector, many investments are needed to increase the coverage and quality of drinking water and basic sanitation to advance in Colombia. Let's to the final part of the story. But before starting the last part of the presentation, which refers to the impact that taxes and social spending have on poverty and income distribution, let's look at the distribution of income by deciles by 2020. For example, decile 10 obtaining 42% of the total income in Colombia. This is an enormous difference that are very difficult to correct through the redistributive policies of the state, taxes and subsidies. And so in this section, we have the objective of establishing the incidence of taxes and social spending on poverty and inequality in Colombia. We use our own tools combining with those of the CEQ of Tulane University. The work we have done at FEDesarrollo with the support of AFD includes analysis from 2017 to 2020. In summary, we find that the incidence of state redistribution mechanisms is important, but that after running a set of simulations, there is enormous room for improvement in these policies. Here is the CEQ model. In the CEQ model, we start the analysis using the market income from household service and aiding pension contribution made by employers. So we obtain the income market plus contribution of pension contributions. After this, we add direct cash transfer, for example, conditional transfer, pensions transfer, and subtract direct taxes, the income tax to get the disposable income. Next, we add indirect transfers in public services, water, energy, gas, and then we subtract indirect taxes to obtain consumable income. And finally, we add in-kind transfers, health and public education, and subtract the copayments. And in each state, we estimate poverty and equality, the Gini coefficient, to obtain the incidence of distributive mechanisms in each income. Okay, let's see the results on poverty and income distribution in each state. Sorry, somebody moved this. Sorry. Okay, this is the total poverty in the left, and this is the extreme poverty at the right. We have 43% of total poverty when we saw the market income. But when we add the direct cash transfer and subtract the direct taxes, the poverty change a little. Then we have the consumable income, and this is the poverty. It is almost the same and is higher because the indirect taxes. And when we add the in-kind transfer of education and health, the poverty is very low comparing with the market income. This is regarding total poverty, we find that the redistributed effect of taxes and social spending are not significant except for spending on health and education, which reduce poverty by 4.5 percentage points. Regarding extreme poverty, the results are more sensitive thanks to cash transfer. And the total effect is a reduction of 7 points in extreme poverty. Yes, in both cases, the value aggregate tax is regressive, and in the consumable income. And these are the results for the functioning of income distribution in 2020. This is the Gini coefficient at the left, and this is the Palma index at the right. Regarding income distribution, these results have similar tendencies, and the most and the most important effects are those of education and health. In the end, the Gini coefficient is reduced by 6 points thanks to the taxes and subsidies in Colombia. 6 points of the Gini coefficient. Lastly, we run some policy simulation for taxes and for social spending. For taxes, we increase the tax base in such a way that the income limit to declare taxes was half of the current value. Second, we modify the progressive tax structure to obtain higher effective rates. Third, we cut exemption in half from 33% of exemption to 17% of net income, and we double the nominal taxes rates on dividends and occasional earnings from 10 to 20%. And with the social spending, we simulate cash transfer during the pandemic, and we change coverage, increase it from 1 million of person, and we introduce a progressive subsidy that was previously flat. Second, a universal coverage of the program for older adults living in poverty was introduced with a transfer of one poverty line, like the reform pension that present tomorrow the government to the Congress, and an extension of the value aggregate taxes reform from 1 to 2 million households. Okay, we did a joint simulation of taxes and social spending using all those rules. And let's look at the results. First, thanks to the changes in social programs, poverty was reduced by almost 10 points in disposable income, and the combining effect of taxes and spending reduced poverty by 14.5 in final income, from 33% of the population to 29% of the population. Regarding extreme poverty, it was reduced 10 points in disposable income and 11 points in final income, from 17% to almost 6%, a reduction of 1/3. The results in the income distribution measured by the Gini coefficient and the Palma coefficient, the simulated changes in social programs and taxes have a huge effect on disposable income by reducing the Gini by 9 points compared to the current 3 points reduction. And the final effect reached 11 points, which would leave Colombia with a redistributive effect like that of some developed countries. If we have these policies, of course. And the last, we did a preliminary analysis of the 2022 tax reform. We also did some simulations of the effects of the tax reform using the survey data. We find that the effects of the tax reform are not significant on the distribution of income, since although the change in the Palma index present a better distribution, the Gini coefficient doesn't change. However, these results are preliminary, since the analysis carried out indicates that in the surveys it is not possible to observe the highest part of the distribution, which is precisely who is most affected by the reform. So in the future, we may combine administrative records from the National Tax Office with survey data in order to better understand the redistributive impacts of the tax reform. The last conclusion, a package that improves the basic income and the universal pension may be the best tool to sustain a population that lives in very precarious conditions of hunger and access to basic services. Second, the current redistribution of disposable income reaches 3 points in the Gini, but with improvement in taxes and social spending, improvement of 8 additional points, 11 points in total, could be achieved. From market income to final income, the changes are transcendental, even with such a market initial concentration. And that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Jairo. I think this is just the main results, but of course we invite all of you to visit our webpage where we have these results. We have the diagnostic on inequality, which is an exhaustive analysis, and you can of course download it and go deeper into the details of the results that Jairo just have explained. It's important as well that the last part of the presentation, as Jairo mentioned, this last reform, the fiscal reform, and all the reforms that the government is going through right now, and that are super important, in fact, to reduce inequalities. And one of the most important, let's say, is the one that Jairo referred to, the pension reform that is going through right now, which is of course one point that will of course reduce if it's progressive in its structure, and will help to reduce inequalities in the country. So I'm glad to welcome Daniel Osorio, who is the Director of Macroeconomic Politics at the Ministry of Economics in Colombia. And I thank him for being here, as well as Lamine said in the introduction. And he will speak us and talk about these big challenges that the government has right now in order to tackle all these big challenges in inequalities, of course, with poverty as well. Daniel, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Felipe, and thank you, Lamine, as well. And thanks to the AFD Festival for this very kind invitation to participate in this panel. So also before starting, I'd like to thank Jairo as well for an excellent presentation. I think he was very clear. And I think he ended up into key points. So first one, the effect of the tax reform, Jairo. I think I understand that the results you have are very preliminary, but we are very interested in them. You're going to work on administrative data later on. And also, I think, you know, just as a suggestion, I think that it would be nice to also think about the reform, not only as a package of taxes, but as a package of taxes plus social expenditure. So I think the idea of the government is to sort of, or the original idea of the government was to pass a tax reform that would allow us to sort of finance more social expenditures. And I think that the effect, the total effect on inequality and poverty and, you know, some of the social outcomes has to take into account not only taxes, but also the particular way in which those taxes are spent. And as you know very well, this is currently being discussed within Congress as part of a supplementary budget that the Ministry of Finance submitted to Congress in like three weeks ago or something like that. But then taking also your, because Jairo ended in this very interesting point on the importance of transfers and universal pensions as part of the, or as part of a package that would be very effective in tackling inequality and poverty in Colombia. So I think that the idea of this presentation is that as you guys know very well, yesterday some of the details of the pension reform that the government is currently working on were released to the press and released to the public, and there's been a very active discussion going on. But given, and the pension reform has many aspects that, I mean, we could talk endlessly about the pension reform here, but I would like to focus on, because of the panel, because of the topic of this panel, I would like to focus more on those aspects of the pension reform that affect equity, that have an impact on the equity of the pension system, and not only on the pension system, but more generally on of the system of protection to old age population. No? So I have just one slide, Felipe, if you can go to the next slide. So this is what I want to focus on. So the pension reform, as you guys, and some of you guys may know this very well, the pension reform essentially is proposing to switch from the system that we have of competition between a pay-as-you-go system and an individual savings system to a system of complementarity between them. And the solution there, the solution that the government is proposing is a pillar system, no? And the pillar system tackles many of the problems of the current pension system, but also many of its fiscal challenges, but particularly also many of its challenges in terms of equity. So in the diagnosis that the government has, and this is a common diagnosis of the current pension system, the pension system is, at least, it is very regressive. It has not sufficient coverage. And it has a problem for fiscal sustainability in the future. In terms of the coverage, no, data suggests that 3/4 of old age population do not have access to a pension. And this is the first thing that the government wanted to correct in the design of the pillar system and the design of the reform to the system of protection to old age population. So the first ingredient, I think the key ingredient for equity is the design of this solidarity pillar or solidarity pillar, or pillar zero, as it's been called in some arenas. And the idea there is consistent with what Fabio was saying, is that we have to recognize the power of direct transfers to improve in terms of inequality and in terms of poverty. And the idea there is that the government will design a direct transfer to old age population without a pension. So more specifically, the proposal that is in the reform is to transfer an amount equivalent to an extreme poverty line, which we estimate to be roughly about 220,000 pesos for this year, but not to all old age population, because I mean, not only resources are limited, but I think we can focalize them more in order to have a stronger impact on poverty and inequality. So the idea was the original idea is to transfer that to about 2.3 million people in old age who are in either extreme poverty or moderate poverty, or what we call frontier poverty, which is basically, according to the categorization that we have in Colombia, it would be it would take the old age population 65 plus without a pension that belong to CISBEN in the categories from A to C3. So those, I think, with that focalization, I think we covered basically most of the population, most of the vulnerable old age population. And with that transfer, so the objective is to eradicate moderate poverty and extreme poverty in old age from this country forever. So that's the objective of the solidarity pillar. We're estimating the total cost of that to be about 7 trillion, slightly less than 7 trillion pesos. But then some of it is already being spent in Colombia Mayor and other transfer programs to old age. So the marginal cost of it, so the additional fiscal effort that the central government has to make for that would be something around 5 trillion pesos, which is fiscally attainable. It fits well into the fiscal order, and this is something that the government can start doing as soon as the pension reform is approved. So this is one step that we want to make to improve in coverage, but also improve more generally in terms of protection to old age. The potential for this to reach a very high number of people and to eradicate extreme and moderate poverty and some of vulnerable and some of the vulnerability in the old age population, well, it's part of the objective, and I think it's a big step in the reduction of poverty and reaching more equality in this country. So that's the sort of what I would say the key component in terms of equity. But there is more than that in the reform. So second, and I have that here in the middle, is what we call the intermediate pillar, in Spanish, the pilar semi-contributivo. And the idea there is to facilitate and improve conditions for people who contribute to the pension system, but in the end, we're not able to reach all conditions for a pension, particularly because they do not have sufficient weeks of contribution. So nowadays, there is a problem there, which is, there are many distortions. So people who don't reach the conditions to get a pension, they get their savings back or their contributions back from either the individual savings system or the pay-as-you-go system. But then that forces them to manage their very own longevity risk, and people are normally not, well trained to manage that longevity risk. So in the end, what ends up happening is that people eventually run out of that money that they got back, and then they are unprotected, right? So we wanted also to solve that, because that is creating a lot of vulnerability in old age population who do not reach a pension. So the idea here is, first of all, to allow mechanisms to provide them insurance against that longevity risk. So we're switching from a system that gives people, people their money back in a way, in full, for a system that provides instead annuities to them. No, and by providing annuities to them, the longevity risk stops falling on the individual person and rather would fall on some financial intermediary. So that's the first thing. But the second is that nowadays people that are into the pay-as-you-go system, into Colpensiones, and don't get a pension, they get their money back without financial returns. Unlike the individual saving system. So you create a distortion or a difference between them. So in order to improve on that and improve on the equality of the system, we're also going to recognize the returns for people who are in the pay-as-you-go system, in Colpensiones. So you sort of match them in a way. And also, the government is also making an effort to subsidize the savings that people have in order to allow them to have sufficient means of living for their old age. So that for the intermediate pillar. But then there are also improvements in the structure of the reform. There are improvements in equity for the mandatory savings world, which is the mandatory savings pillar, which is where people will contribute to Colpensiones in some form, and then in some other form, for those of you who are well off enough, would contribute also to the individual savings system, to a private pension fund. And the idea there is that we have discovered, and this is also a common diagnosis, that the current pay-as-you-go system is very, very regressive. No, so people, and this is the graph that I have in the right panel, which has been calculated by the brilliant team here, the the General Directorate of Macroeconomic Policy at the Ministry of Finance. And the idea there is that we can calculate the pension subsidy for different deciles of people who we assume to reach the conditions to get a pension. And indeed, the system looks progressive all the way up to the 7th decile, because subsidies as a percentage of life income, they fall as you progress along deciles. But then eventually, after decile 7, you see that the system becomes very regressive. So the graph will, the dark blue line here, which is the status quo, it sort of switches back, in the sense that people of eventually the highest deciles in income distribution in the economy get larger subsidies as a percentage of their income, but also as a percentage of the total fiscal cost, which makes the system very regressive. And what we have discovered is that by introducing this pillar system, this complementary pillar system, in which after a threshold, or if your income falls below a threshold, you contribute to the pay-as-you-go, to the Colpensiones system, and if your income falls above the threshold, you also contribute to a private pension fund. By just putting a threshold, you improve in terms of equity, because you stop giving subsidies to very high pensions, which cost a lot. So the idea here was to establish a sort of threshold that would allow us to improve in terms of equity, but can also guarantee us that pensions are sufficiently subsidized for people who have a relatively low income in the distribution. And we have discovered that as we move from the status quo, which is dark blue, to say a 4 minimum wages threshold, which is the light blue, or a 3 minimum wage threshold, which is the final proposal of the government that will run in Congress, and that's the yellow line here. We improve in sort of bringing down these subsidies to very high pensions, and therefore the system becomes much more progressive. Of course, there will be a lot of discussion about this in Congress. But Felipe, thank you so much. I want to finish on this note. So these are sort of three components of the pension reform that I mean, you guys will hear a lot about this pension reform these days. So this is the components that I think are most relevant to think about the effects of it on equity and inequality and poverty in the country. Thanks so much, Felipe, again, for your kind invitation.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Super interesting presentation, and you have a big challenge there as well, going through the Congress right now with this proposal. And right now, I will give the floor to Laura Castillo, who is an economist from the UNDP in Colombia. And we have invited her because they have just made a super interesting analysis, research on inequalities and the perceptions on inequalities. And we thought that this is very interesting and that will complement very well what we have seen so far with our studies. And in fact, it will be as well super interesting for you, Daniel, in the ministry. So because this gives very interesting results. So Laura, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Felipe. Okay, so, well, good morning, everyone. My name is Laura Castillo Endec. I am part of the team of the UNDP in the Human Development Report for Colombia. And as Felipe mentioned, I'm going to present you our main results about the document that is called Perceptions and Subjective Wellbeing in Colombia, Beyond Traditional Indicators. So let me begin with giving you some context where we publish this document. Nowadays, we're working on the Human Development Report for the country, and the main objective is to analyze the persistence of high inequalities and low productivity in Colombia. For that aim, we chose four main topics: human capital, where we analyze education and labor market, access to justice, regional peace, and environment and climate change. The motivation of doing this work is because we saw that with objective variables, we could only explain partially the persistence of inequalities in Colombia. So we ask ourselves, where can the rest of the persistence be explained? We try with this document of perceptions to complement this analysis to answer what can the rest of the persistence be explained with subjective variables. And specifically, we chose perceptions of poverty and inequality, trust, and subjective well-being. Today, I'm going to focus on the first one and partially in the second one because of the topic of this webinar. Very shortly, what methodology did we use? We start by looking some literature, international literature, and we found that the OECD has a very solid and useful conceptual framework about how to deal and how to analyze subjective indicators. We also read a lot of studies from other countries in which we read one of the AFD that they did about the perceptions in Mexico of inequality. And the work we did were simple relationships between variables without any causality. However, we saw that with those relationships, we could clearly show how perceptions influence people's attitudes and decisions. So our main source was a social pulse survey of Daniel. We had the chance to introduce some own questions and model about poverty and inequality perceptions. And this was very useful because this survey is representative in 23 cities in Colombia, and also it is representative by social demographic and also income groups. Of course, we use another service like Latinobarometro and two others of Dani as a complement of the social pulse survey. So what was our main result? We saw that perceptions of poverty and inequality do contribute to the persistence of inequality in Colombia. So how did we get there? So I'm going to present our 5 main points. First, Colombians' perceptions of poverty and inequality differs from objective indicators. As you can see in this graph, poor, 1 every 3 poor don't believe or don't consider themselves as poor, while, for example, the middle class, 1 every 4 people in the middle class do believe that they are poor. So we see that not always objective indicators are in line with subjective indicators, or vice versa. We also saw that people don't know what the magnitude of inequality, economic inequality. We see in the left graph that, for example, in average, people believe that the 5th quintile has 44% of the income, while in reality they have almost 60%. And on the right graph, the graph to the right, we see that there is a tendency that people position themselves in the middle positions of the distribution. So the poor feel or consider themselves less poor than they actually are, and the middle class and the upper class believe that they are also in the middle positions. The latest is it's a very important point. This is like a parenthesis. This is the objective distribution of social classes in Colombia. And the point I want to make here is that the middle class, unlike the belief, they are not in the middle positions, not in Colombia. They belong to the 20% more rich in Colombia, most of the middle class, as you can see here. And in general, they have, or 70% of the population have lower incomes than the middle class. So the point here is that middle class in Colombia, and of course upper class, is in a privileged position in comparison to the rest of the population. The second point is that in Colombia, we found that there is concern about the levels of inequality of income and also of opportunities. However, this concern is not always the same for everybody. We saw, for example, that there is a high perception of injustice in the distribution income, with 81% of the population believing that it is unfair or very unfair, and also a perception of injustice in opportunities like health, education, and access to justice. However, when we ask or divide these levels of concern by education and other social demographic variables, we see that people with more education, the people who perceive themselves as in the highest income positions, and also those who believe that they experience social mobility, show lower levels of concern about inequality. So we see that it is not homogeneous, this concern. What happened, or what is important to be concerned about inequality? Because we see that, they usually translate, or the concern usually translates into demand for redistributive policies. Here in Colombia, we see that there is a relationship of the concern and the demand. However, this doesn't translate into willingness to pay taxes. So in this graph, we can see, for example, that people that is most concerned about inequality place more responsibility on the government to reduce income disparities. And this is a variable that the OECD has used for a proxy to demand for redistribution. We also saw that Colombians agree on who should receive government aid. In the graph to the left, we see that mainly only the poor class, or people believe that only the poor class should receive this governmental aid. However, people or Colombians disagree on who should pay taxes. And we see this in the right graph, that, for example, 1/3 of the population believe that everybody since decile 1 should pay taxes, and there is not a clear consensus. And more than half of the population believe that the middle class should pay taxes. There is a consensus that the tax structure should be progressive, with 92% of the Colombians agreeing on that. However, there is very little willingness to pay taxes on part of the entire society, including middle class and upper class. So in this graph, we see that when we ask people what do they believe they pay nowadays in taxes, and then we ask them how much should they pay, we see a very big gap between those answers. We see finally that there are institutional, so we saw that there is concern in Colombia, and there is but people don't want to pay taxes. So how can we explain this? We saw that there are institutional barriers, such as institutional distrust, that can affect a demand for redistribution. In Colombia, we saw that there is very little trust in the government and other public entities, likewise in Latin America. And also, there is a very important relationship about inequality and trust. So we see in this graph, for example, that people who believe that inequality levels are higher, or they are more concerned about inequality, they tend to trust less in the politicians or in the government. So with this, these are our main results. And the conclusions are that first, people act based on their perceptions rather than based on their reality. So it is very important and essential to complement objective indicators with subjective ones. The second conclusion is that people tend to underestimate the magnitude of inequality. And so this translates into insufficient support for redistribution policies, and hence this contributes to the persistence of inequality, which was our main question. And finally, we saw that Colombia is submerged in a trap of inequality and low trust. And this is because, as we saw, inequality reduces trust, and low trust affects the demand of redistribution policies. And without the support for redistribution, it is harder to reduce poverty and inequality. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. It's super interesting. I think it completes very well what we have said before. So I will invite Jairo and Daniel to turn on their cameras and to join me, because I can see that there are some questions already. I think you can see them as well. And yeah, just one question that I saw on the question tab. And Jairo, you already replied. The simulations we did a lot of simulations. One of them were because we thought that it was interesting to see the reaction of inequalities, just moving some variables. But the main of them where with discussions with the government, the previous one and the actual one, we discussed we discussed with them a lot in order to know what or which could be the transformations or the modifications to the to the variables, and either on the fiscal side or in the expenditure side. So that would be complete. I don't know if Jairo, if you want to respond a little bit on that question, but I can see that there is a question very interesting about like the fiscal stability, how the government, uh, and hearing a little bit what Laura said, knowing that the country has a big informality rate, no, Daniel, that it's quite complicated to raise the funds through the fiscal system, and that you and with the LADIAN, the fiscal entity, you are doing a lot of effort so people can pay more taxes and I mean their equal share. But we see that as Laura said, people is not always willing to pay that money because they don't see what they I mean the works, or they doesn't feel that their money is being used in the proper way. So it's a lot of challenges, no? And how you arrived inside of the ministry to deal with all these issues, no, and to do the expenditure, to put the money, to spend the money, but at the same time to collect all this money, no, it's quite challenging, I guess.
Yes, Felipe, for sure. I think the challenge of fiscal sustainability and the ability of the government to raise tax revenues in order to achieve its goals is always a challenge in the design of fiscal policy, particularly at a time where we're working simultaneously on a number of social reforms that have different impacts on informality and the labor markets, and also at the same time that we're working on a supplementary budget to spend more on social programs. So I think what you mentioned about the legitimacy of public spending and the legitimacy of the government's action in spending tax revenues that are collected from people is essential to sort of create a more equitable financial system for the future. But let me say a couple of things regarding the ability of the government to finance these programs that we have now. So thinking about the pension reform, so some of you guys might have noticed that one of the provisions of the pension reform is that the government will create a fund to save those excess contributions that will flow from private pension funds to the pay-as-you-go system, to Colpensiones. And then the idea there is to provide a fund that will allow us in the future to pay some of that pension debt without additional fiscal effort from the national budget. And then the question is, and it's similar, that's a question that also applies, for instance, to the health reform, which is, okay, how to finance these extra needs that the government has for the health reform and now for the pension reform. So these direct transfers, particularly also because if you read the text of the pension reform, it says very clearly that any provisions that it contains must be consistent with the fiscal rule and with the medium-term fiscal framework. So there is a challenge there. But then the government has, and this is the commitment that the government has established from last year, which is that the government is committed to fiscal sustainability. So all of this, and then there is the tax reform and the income from the tax reform, and that will allow us to fund some of those social programs and direct transfers. So this year there is some provisions for social expenditure, but in the future, for next years, that the permanent tax revenue that's coming from the tax reform can be used for these efforts. But not only that, I'm also talking about the topic of inequality. The government also has and will have in the near future the ability to sort of change the composition of expenditure in such a way that it also helps inequality and also to finance the social programs. And here I'm particularly talking about fuel subsidies. So you know that this country has accumulated huge fuel subsidies since 2021. And those subsidies are clearly regressive, and the government is working hard to sort of reduce as quickly as possible those fuel subsidies. And those fuel subsidies, because of the size they've got nowadays, they're about 30, this country spends about 30 trillion pesos a year in those fuel subsidies. So the idea is to eliminate those as quickly as possible, and then you open up a lot of possibilities to spend that money that you're spending now on fuel subsidies. And I guess this idea of the social programs and the social objectives that this government has can be financed using those resources that are nowadays being badly spent in regressive subsidies. So that's one way in which there will be progress soon. So I think there is and with this I finish. There is this apparent, in the public debate, there is this apparent tension between fiscal sustainability and the achievability of social objectives. And I think that's a false dilemma. I think what this government is proving is that you can have both in a way. By just being, there is the need for more tax revenue, and that's something that we worked on last year. There is the need for the legitimacy of public expenditures, for sure. But then there is also the fact that we can redesign the structure that we have, not only for the pension reform, but also, for instance, for these fuel subsidies, that by designing those things in a smarter fashion that's been done in the past, we can improve both in the ability of the government to pay its obligations, so in terms of fiscal sustainability, but also in its ability to finance social programs that will increase equity and will reduce poverty. So there is no tension there. There is no trade-off. I think that's something that we're working on, and I expect us to continue working on in the future.
Thank you very much, Daniel. I don't see. I don't know if Jairo or Laura, you have some comments on this. I see that we are already almost at the end of our time of this webinar. So Jairo, I don't know if you have some comments, or Laura, do you would like to raise about these topics that includes a lot of topics now: informality, labor market, pensions, as Daniel was explaining. Would you like to raise one point?
Yes, Felipe. Somebody asked which are those reforms that require a better focus or priority in order to decrease inequalities. I think that the best thing will always be to combine, like Daniel said, tax reforms and social reforms financed precisely with those new taxes. However, given that income distribution is so unequal in Colombia, we must have social policies that change the state of affairs in the future. This is concentrating on the accumulation of social capital. This is education, health, and nutrition. I think that subsidies do not change the situation in the future. So this is the reason, because we have to concentrate the efforts on the accumulation of social capital for the young people and for the children.
And when you mentioned that, I would like to join what you just said, Jairo, with a little bit what Laura explained in her presentation, is that we need as well better public policies, but we need better education, so people understand where they at the distributional income, where they stand off, how much they earn in average, and I have seen lately that there are a lot of web pages that where you go, and the OECD has one where you go and you put all your incomes and how many members of your household has, etc., and that put you in the distributional income, and it's super interesting because there you can have like an aware of how much you are paying, if you are paying less or more, and all these issues, as you said, Jairo, like education, more financial education, more asset in education per se, will give more, and I guess a better future, because right now if you just take one shot period, it will be quite difficult. So I think there's a lot of investments to do, a lot of efforts to do, a lot of work to do. Yeah, I think it's super interesting because all those three, I mean, the three presentations, the three results that we presented are super complementary. I'm not seeing more questions. I see that Laura, you responded to almost all the questions that you have for you on the methodology and how many people responded to your service. And that's one point super interesting. I don't know if you would like to say two things about how you raised the information through the DANE, which is an important player in all these discussions, because the information came from them, the statistical information that we use for all these studies. No, so maybe you want to raise this point, and then maybe we can finish with that.
Yeah, sure. Well,
Laura, I want to ask you that in the maybe 2006, in the poverty mission, we did some exercise on subjective poverty. And I would like to know if you compare these results to understand if this has changed over time.
Okay, so well, I'm going to answer first Felipe's question. And then yours, Jairo. We worked with the DANE, and it was a very good alliance, because we could introduce our questions during 5 months in the social pulse survey, which focus on perceptions in general of Colombians. We think that the DANE has introducing this new survey because it started in 2020 during the pandemic. It allows a new perspective, and we believe that the DANE should continue with this kind of questions, but because, as you could see, the results are very interesting and very telling, comparing them to objective indicators. And we, during this, each month, it's about 10,000 surveys. So we had the chance to have a very big survey, or yes, about 50,000 people responding our questions. And about Jairo's question, we saw that we compare the subjective poverty, which means the percentage of people that consider themselves as poor during the years. The DANE began asking these questions in 2008. And what we saw is that on average, this percentage of people that consider themselves as poor is very, very similar to the monetary poverty rate, except during the pandemic, where we see that perceptions are very different, or at least the gap increased during the last 2 years, 2020 and 2021. However, if we compare the rates, or the subjective poverty, with multidimensional poverty, we see that there is always a gap. So this is telling us that people have in mind their income. However, it is not the only thing they have, because even though the national poverty rate, monetary poverty rate, and the subjective poverty rate are similar, when we see, for example, in rural areas, we see that the perception is there is a very big gap between poverty rate and subjective. For example, for 2021, the subjective poverty in rural areas was 70%, while the objective indicator was about 45. So to sum up, we see that there is a tendency in the national average of subjective and objective, and it has been very similar during the years. I mean, the behavior goes in a similar tendencies. However, when we go beyond the national level or the national average, we see that there are big differences in the perceptions and in the objective indicators.
Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura. I see the Jairo had a problem with his camera, but I think he can hear you. So seeing the it's 15:35 for me. It's almost 11 for you in Colombia. I would like to thank you all for being here. For Daniel, thank you very much. Thank you very much for being here. You have a lot of challenges, and please count on us to be with you, to accompany you in all these research possibilities and studies that we could be able to help. So Laura, thank you very much. Thanks
Felipe,
to
thank you so much.
UNDP.
You know very well we're currently doing that, so thank you.
And thank you very much, Laura. Thank you very much, the UNDP, for being here and presenting this study. And Jairo, as always, thank you very much for the presentation.
Thank you, Felipe, and thank you for the AFD for the invitation.
Thank you very much, and to all the participants, do not hesitate to be always looking for the research conversations that we have at the AFD, and where we are going to publish and present all the studies that we're doing here. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Cheers, thanks. Bye.